The steam was still rising from my coffee mug when I heard the familiar click of Melissa's heels approaching my cubicle. It was barely 9 in the morning, and most of the team hadn't even settled in yet. The Chicago office had this quiet hum that I'd grown to love over the past 5 years. Keyboards clicking, the coffee machine gurgling, and the distant sound of the L train rumbling past our windows on LaSalle Street. "Sarah, could you come to my office for a moment?" Her voice had that rehearsed quality that made my stomach drop. I'd heard that tone before, usually right before someone got bad news about their performance review, or when budgets were getting cut. I followed her down the hallway, past the conference room where we'd spent countless late nights debugging code, past the break room where I'd celebrated every small victory with my teammates. Her office door clicked shut behind us, and suddenly the familiar space felt foreign and cold. Melissa didn't waste time with pleasantries. She sat behind her mahogany desk, the one she'd insisted on importing from some boutique furniture store in River North, and pulled out a manila envelope. Her expression was practiced, like she'd been rehearsing this moment in the mirror. "Sarah, we're going to have to let you go." The words hit me like a physical blow. There's been ongoing concerns about team alignment, and, frankly, some issues with insubordination that we can't overlook anymore. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Insubordination? In 5 years, I'd never received a single written warning. I'd built half the systems this company ran on, working weekends and holidays when everyone else was at home with their families. "I'm sorry. What exactly are you referring to?" I managed to ask, my voice surprisingly steady. She shifted in her chair, and I caught that look, the one she always got when she was about to deliver a line she'd prepared. "There have been multiple instances where you've undermined my authority in meetings, questioning my decisions in front of clients and team members." My mind raced back to last week's client presentation. Melissa had been explaining our database architecture to a potential investor, and she'd gotten the technical details completely wrong. She'd claimed our system could handle 10 times more concurrent users than it actually could. I'd quietly corrected her, trying to save us from promising something we couldn't deliver. Was that insubordination? Or maybe it was the time she'd suggested we could implement a new feature in 2 weeks, when I knew it would take at least 2 months. I gently explained the technical complexity, trying to manage expectations. Had that been undermining her authority? "I see," I said, taking the envelope from her outstretched hand. My fingers felt numb as I held it. Melissa leaned back in her chair, and I caught something in her expression. Satisfaction, maybe even relief. It hit me then that this wasn't about team alignment or insubordination. This was about the fact that she'd never liked being corrected by someone who actually understood the technology we were building. She'd come from a marketing background at a consulting firm downtown, landed this VP of engineering role because she knew how to talk to investors and board members. But she'd never written a line of code in her life, never stayed up until 3 in the morning tracking down a bug that was crashing our servers. "You'll need to return your laptop and access card to security," she continued, glancing at her watch like she had somewhere more important to be. "HR will be in touch about your final paycheck and benefits." I stood up slowly, tucking the envelope under my arm. The surreal quality of the moment was starting to wear off, replaced by something I couldn't quite name yet. Not anger, exactly. Something colder and more focused. "Thank you for your time, Melissa." The words came out calmer than I felt. I walked out of her office with my head up, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. She had no idea what she'd just done. As I gathered my personal items from my desk, the small plant my mom had given me, the photo of my college graduation, the coffee mug with the Python logo, I realized something that made me smile despite everything. Melissa had just fired the one person who legally owned the core technology that kept this company running. Tomorrow, she was going to learn that lesson the hard way. Walking out of that building on Michigan Avenue, I couldn't help but think about how different things had been when I first started. 5 years ago, I was fresh out of Northwestern, carrying student loans and big dreams about changing the world through technology. The company was barely more than a handful of people crammed into a shared workspace in Wicker Park, surviving on ramen noodles and the kind of optimism that only comes from not knowing how hard things are about to get. Back then, our technology platform was a disaster. The previous developer had cobbled together something that barely worked, full of security holes and code that looked like it had been written by someone who'd learned programming from YouTube videos. The system crashed every few days. We were losing customer data, and our biggest client was threatening to leave. I remember my first week, staying late in that cramped office while everyone else had gone home. The building's heating didn't work properly, so I'd code wrapped in my winter coat, debugging problems that seemed impossible to solve. But I loved it. There was something pure about those early days. Just me, my laptop, and the challenge of building something that actually worked. That's when I started developing what would become the DataCore framework. I didn't call it that initially. It was just a collection of modules I wrote to solve specific problems. A more efficient way to handle user authentication. A better system for managing database connections. Small improvements that added up to something bigger. Over the next 2 years, I essentially rewrote the entire platform from scratch. I created new data structures that could handle our growing user base, implemented security protocols that actually protected our customers' information, and built a framework that was not only stable, but fast enough to give us a real competitive advantage. What most people don't realize is that good software isn't just about writing code. It's about understanding problems that don't exist yet. I was building systems that could scale to handle millions of users when we barely had thousands. I was implementing security measures for threats that hadn't even been invented yet. I was thinking 5 years ahead while everyone else was just trying to survive the next quarter. The breakthrough came during my 3rd year. I'd been working on a proprietary caching system that could dramatically improve our response times. It was complex work, the kind of thing that required understanding both the theoretical computer science and the practical limitations of real-world hardware. I spent months on it, testing and refining until I had something that was genuinely innovative. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I was at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park, reviewing the final code, when I realized what I'd created wasn't just an improvement. It was a fundamental advancement in how this type of system could work. Other companies would eventually try to build something similar, but it would take them years to catch up. I called my lawyer, a friend from college who'd gone into intellectual property law. "I think I need to file a patent," I told him. The company was still small then. No legal department, no policies about intellectual property. Everyone was too busy trying to stay afloat to think about who owned what. The patent application was straightforward. I had all the documentation, every commit to our version control system, every design document, every email where I'd explained my approach to solving these problems. My name was on everything because I'd been the one doing the work. 3 months later, I had a patent in my name for the core technology that was powering our entire platform. I kept it quiet, not because I was planning anything, but because I believed in what we were building as a team. I thought we were all in this together, that my success was everyone's success. I kept developing the system, adding new features, fixing bugs, making it more robust and efficient. By the time I got fired, DataCore was handling millions of transactions a day for dozens of major clients. It was the engine that drove everything. Our mobile app, our web platform, our analytics dashboard, even our internal tools. What Melissa never understood was that the technology wasn't just something the company had. It was something I had created and legally owned. She saw me as an employee who could be replaced, not realizing that replacing me would mean replacing the foundational technology that made the company possible. Standing on the sidewalk outside our office building, watching people hurry past on their lunch breaks, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not anger exactly, but a kind of clarity. I'd spent 5 years being quiet, being collaborative, putting the team first. I'd let other people take credit for my work because I thought it was the right thing to do. But now, holding that termination letter in my hand, I realized that loyalty was a two-way street, and Melissa had just shown me exactly how much my loyalty was worth to her. I spent the rest of that day in my apartment in Logan Square, transforming my living room into something that looked like a law office had exploded. My dining table disappeared under stacks of papers, and I had my laptop open with multiple tabs running. Email archives, patent databases, legal research sites, and backup systems I'd set up years ago. The first thing I did was pull up every email I'd ever sent about the DataCore system. 5 years of digital breadcrumbs, all time-stamped and stored in my personal Gmail account. I'd been methodical about keeping records, partly because I'm naturally organized, and partly because I'd learned early in my career that documentation saves lives in the tech world. I printed everything. Email threads where I'd explained the technical architecture to potential investors. Messages where I'd outlined development timelines and resource requirements. Conversations where I'd walked other engineers through the system's design principles. Each page that came out of my printer was another piece of evidence that this wasn't just some project I'd worked on. It was something I'd conceived, designed, and built from the ground up. My coffee table became a timeline. I arranged documents chronologically, from my first sketches of the system architecture to the most recent performance reports. The patent certificate went right in the center, official government-issued proof that the core technology belonged to me, not to the company. Then I started going through the company's employee handbook, which I'd downloaded to my personal computer months ago. I highlighted every section that talked about intellectual property, employment policies, and termination procedures. What I found was interesting and useful. The handbook clearly stated that employees retained rights to work they'd developed independently, especially if it was created before joining the company or during personal time. I'd done most of the original data core development during evenings and weekends, working on my own equipment, using my own resources. The company had benefited from my innovation, but according to their own policies, they hadn't acquired ownership of it just by employing me. By dinner time, I had filled 3 manila folders with documentation. One contained all the technical evidence, code commits, design documents, development logs. Another held all the legal paperwork, the patent, licensing agreements, and relevant employment policies. The third was full of correspondence that established the timeline and my role in creating the system. I ordered Chinese takeout from the place down the street and kept working. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. This wasn't about revenge or spite. It was about protecting something I'd created, something that represented years of my life and creativity. If the company wanted to use my technology, they were going to have to negotiate for it like any other business relationship. Around midnight, I started drafting a letter to HR. I kept it simple and professional, laying out the facts without emotion or accusation. I explained that I held the patent for the core technology the company was using, that I'd been terminated without cause, and that I wanted to clarify the legal situation before any misunderstandings arose. I didn't threaten anything. I didn't demand anything. I just stated the facts and requested a meeting to discuss the situation. Let them draw their own conclusions about what this meant for their business. The hardest part was deciding what came next. I could have just walked away, found another job, and let them figure out on their own that their core technology belonged to someone they'd just fired. But that felt too passive, too much like the old version of myself who'd spent 5 years minimizing her own contributions. Instead, I made copies of everything. I put one set in a safe deposit box at the bank, uploaded digital copies to a secure cloud storage service, and mailed another set to my lawyer. If this was going to become a legal battle, I wanted to be prepared. I also started researching the company's business model, looking at their client contracts and revenue streams. Nearly 80% of their income came from services that directly relied on the data core system. Their biggest selling point to clients was the speed and reliability of their platform. Speed and reliability that came from technology I'd developed. Looking at those numbers, I realized that Melissa had made a much bigger mistake than either of us had initially understood. She hadn't just fired an employee, she'd potentially crippled the company's ability to operate. Without a licensing agreement, they couldn't legally continue using the system that powered their entire business model. I set my alarm for 6 in the morning and tried to get some sleep, but my mind was racing. Tomorrow, I would walk into that HR office and change everything. Not just for me, but for every other engineer who'd been taken for granted. Every other person who'd been told they were replaceable while their work was irreplaceable. The funny thing was, I wasn't nervous. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I needed to do. I'd spent too long being quiet, too long letting other people control the narrative about my work and my value. Tomorrow, I would start telling my own story. I arrived at the office building at 7:30 the next morning, a full hour before most people would start trickling in. The security guard, Marcus, looked surprised to see me. We'd chatted countless times over the years about his night classes at community college and his daughter's soccer games. "Morning, Sarah." "You're here early today," he said, buzzing me through the turnstiles. "Got some business to take care of," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. I didn't want to explain that I'd technically been fired yesterday and was now returning to potentially destroy the company's legal standing. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt longer than usual. I was wearing my best suit, a navy blue one I'd bought for job interviews years ago, but rarely had occasion to wear. My briefcase contained everything I'd organized the night before, neatly arranged in folders with color-coded tabs. I felt like I was heading into the most important presentation of my life. Daniel Chen, the head of HR, was already at his desk with a cup of coffee and what looked like a stack of termination paperwork. He was a decent guy, someone I'd always gotten along with during the company's quarterly reviews and team-building events. We'd bonded over our shared love of science fiction novels and Chicago deep dish pizza debates. "Sarah, good morning," he said, standing up with a confused smile. "I got Melissa's email about completing your offboarding process. I have to say, this came as quite a surprise. You've always been one of our most reliable people." I sat down across from his desk, setting my briefcase on the floor beside me. "Daniel, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. Before we go through any paperwork, I was hoping I could share some information that might be relevant to the situation." He nodded, settling back into his chair. "Of course. What's on your mind?" I opened my briefcase and pulled out the first folder. "I'd like to read a brief statement, if that's okay. It concerns some legal issues that I think the company should be aware of." Daniel's expression shifted slightly. In 5 years of working together, we'd never had a conversation that involved the word legal. He leaned forward, giving me his full attention. I unfolded the statement I'd written the night before. My hands were steady, my voice calm. "On March 15th, 2020, I filed for and received patent number 11,234,567 for a proprietary data processing and caching system that I developed. This system, which I called DataCore, has been the foundation of this company's technology platform for the past 4 years." I placed the patent certificate on his desk. Daniel's eyes immediately fixed on it, scanning the official seal and my name in bold letters across the top. The patent covers the core algorithms, data structures, and processing methods that enable our platform to handle high-volume transactions efficiently. This includes the user authentication system, the database optimization protocols, and the real-time analytics engine that our clients depend on. Daniel picked up the patent certificate, examining it more closely. I could see his expression changing from confusion to concern to something approaching alarm. "I want to be clear," I continued, "that I developed this technology independently, largely during my own time and using my own resources. The company has been using it under what I believed was an implied license based on my employment. However, given yesterday's termination, I wanted to clarify the legal status of this intellectual property before any misunderstandings arise." The silence in the room was absolute. Daniel set the patent certificate down carefully, as if it might explode. "Sarah," he said slowly, "are you saying that the company doesn't own the technology that runs our entire platform?" "That's correct. I own the patent, and therefore the exclusive rights to the technology. The company has been using it with my permission as an employee, but that arrangement would naturally need to be reconsidered given the change in my employment status." Daniel was staring at the patent certificate like it was a bomb that had just started ticking. "And this covers how much of our system?" I pulled out another folder, this one containing technical documentation. "Approximately 85% of our core functionality relies on patented algorithms and processes. The mobile app, the web platform, the client dashboard, and most of our internal tools all use this technology as their foundation." He was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see the implications dawning on him. Without the right to use my technology, the company couldn't operate. They couldn't serve their existing clients, couldn't take on new business, and couldn't even maintain their current systems. "I'm not here to negotiate or make demands," I said, keeping my voice professional. "I just wanted to ensure that all parties understand the legal situation before I decide how to proceed." I thought it would be better to have this conversation now rather than through lawyers later. Daniel nodded slowly, but I could see he was already thinking about phone calls he'd need to make and meetings he'd need to schedule. "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, Sarah. This is This is obviously a significant development. I'm going to need to discuss this with the executive team immediately. I understand. I'll be available if you need any additional information or documentation. As I stood to leave, Daniel looked up at me with something that might have been respect. Sarah, can I ask you something? How long have you been planning this? I smiled for the first time since walking into his office. I wasn't planning anything, Daniel. I was just protecting my work. Sometimes the best defense is simply knowing what you're worth. I was barely back in my apartment when my phone started ringing. The first call came from Daniel at 10:15, asking if I could send him digital copies of all the documentation I'd shown him. The second call, 20 minutes later, was from someone I didn't recognize, the company's outside legal counsel, requesting an emergency meeting. By noon, my phone was buzzing constantly. Text messages from coworkers asking if I was okay, missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and emails from people I hadn't heard from in months. Word was spreading through the office that something major was happening, and my name was somehow at the center of it. I ignored most of it, focusing instead on organizing my thoughts and preparing for whatever came next. I'd opened a door that couldn't be closed, and now I needed to be ready for the consequences. The call I'd been expecting came at 2:30. It was James Morrison, the CEO, and his voice had a careful quality that told me he'd been coached by lawyers before picking up the phone. Sarah, I hope you're doing well. I understand you met with Daniel this morning about some intellectual property matters. I was hoping we could sit down and talk about this situation. I'd be happy to discuss it, James. But I'll need to have my attorney present for any formal conversations about licensing or legal matters. There was a pause. Of course, that's perfectly reasonable. Would tomorrow afternoon work for you? After we hung up, I called my lawyer, Mike Patel, who'd been handling my patent applications and other legal matters. We'd gone to Northwestern together, and he'd built a successful practice specializing in intellectual property law for tech companies. Sarah, I have to say, this is one of the most interesting cases I've seen in years, he said, after I'd explained the situation. You're in an incredibly strong position legally. The company has been using your patented technology without a licensing agreement, and now they've terminated your employment. They're essentially stuck. What do you think they'll do? They'll try to negotiate a licensing deal as quickly as possible. They can't afford to shut down their operations while they develop alternative technology, and replacing your system would take months or years. You hold all the cards here. That evening, I met my friend Lisa for dinner at a small Italian place in our neighborhood. She worked as a project manager at a different tech company, and I'd been filling her in on the situation over the past few days. So let me get this straight, she said, twirling pasta around her fork. They fired you for being too smart and too honest, and now they're discovering that you actually own the technology that makes their entire business possible. That's a pretty accurate summary. And what about Melissa? How's she handling all this? I'd been wondering the same thing. I haven't heard from her directly, but I imagine she's having a rough day. As it turned out, Melissa was having much worse than a rough day. The next morning, Mike called me with an update he'd gotten from his contact at the company's law firm. Apparently, there was a pretty intense meeting yesterday evening. The board of directors spent 3 hours going through your employment file and the circumstances of your termination. They're not happy with how this was handled. What does that mean for Melissa? Well, let's just say that firing someone who owns the company's core technology without conducting proper due diligence is the kind of mistake that ends careers, especially when that person has a spotless employment record and no history of actual performance issues. The formal meeting took place in a conference room at the company's law firm downtown. It was surreal walking into that gleaming office building on West Monroe, knowing that I was no longer an employee, but something more like a business partner, or a potential adversary. James was there with Daniel and 2 lawyers I didn't recognize. Melissa was notably absent. Before we begin, James said, I want to personally apologize for how your termination was handled. After reviewing the situation, it's clear that there were procedural errors and a lack of proper investigation into the circumstances. Mike and I exchanged glances. This was better than we'd hoped for. We'd like to discuss the possibility of a licensing agreement that would allow us to continue using your technology while compensating you fairly for your intellectual property. The negotiation took 2 days. In the end, we agreed on a deal that gave me a substantial upfront payment plus ongoing royalties based on the company's revenue. I wasn't just getting my job back, I was becoming a partner in the business I'd helped build. The official announcement went out to the company on Friday afternoon. I was being brought back not as an employee, but as a technology consultant and intellectual property partner. The email was carefully worded, but anyone paying attention could read between the lines. Melissa's resignation was announced the same day. No farewell party, no company-wide goodbye email, just a brief note that she was pursuing other opportunities, and that her responsibilities would be redistributed among the existing team. I never saw her again. I heard through the grapevine that she'd landed a job at a marketing firm, far away from the tech world where her limitations had been so thoroughly exposed. I didn't feel vindicated or victorious, just relieved that the whole ordeal was over. Standing in my old office the following Monday, looking out at the Chicago skyline, I realized that everything had changed. I wasn't just Sarah the engineer anymore. I was Sarah the business owner, Sarah the patent holder, Sarah the person who'd stood up for herself when it mattered most. The scared, quiet employee who'd walked out of Melissa's office a week ago was gone. In her place was someone who understood her own value and wasn't afraid to protect it. 6 months later, I was sitting in a coffee shop in River North, reviewing the business plan for my new consulting firm, TechShield Solutions. The licensing deal with my former company had provided me with enough financial security to take risks I'd never imagined possible. More importantly, it had given me something I'd never had before: complete control over my professional life. The story of what happened had spread through Chicago's tech community faster than I'd expected. Word traveled through meetups, conferences, and the informal networks that connect engineers across the city. I started getting emails from other developers who'd found themselves in similar situations. Brilliant people who'd built incredible things, but had never thought to protect their intellectual property. My first client was Maria Santos, a data scientist who'd developed a revolutionary machine learning algorithm while working for a consulting firm. She'd been passed over for promotion 3 times while watching less qualified colleagues advance past her. When she finally decided to leave, she discovered that her algorithm had become the foundation of a new product line worth millions. "I never thought about filing a patent," she told me during our first meeting. "I was so focused on solving the problem, I didn't think about who would own the solution." I helped her document her work, establish her intellectual property rights, and negotiate a licensing deal that made her financially independent. Watching her walk out of that final meeting with a check for more money than she'd made in 5 years of employment reminded me why I'd started this business in the first place. The work was challenging in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't just about understanding technology or intellectual property law. It was about helping people recognize their own value and find the courage to demand what they deserved. Too many brilliant engineers, especially women and minorities, had been conditioned to be grateful for whatever opportunities they were given, never thinking to ask for equity or ownership of their innovations. I started speaking at conferences, not about technical topics, but about protecting yourself in the tech industry. My talk, Know Your Worth, a technical person's guide to intellectual property, became surprisingly popular. I'd expected audiences of maybe 20 or 30 people, but I found myself presenting to packed rooms of hundreds of developers, all hungry for information about how to avoid the trap I'd nearly fallen into. The most rewarding part wasn't the money or the recognition. It was the messages I received from people who'd heard my story and decided to take action in their own careers. A software engineer in Austin who'd negotiated equity in a startup instead of accepting a standard salary. A product manager in Seattle who'd filed for a patent on her innovative user interface design. A machine learning researcher in Boston who'd left her corporate job to start her own consulting practice. My relationship with my former company evolved into something genuinely collaborative. They continued to use my technology, but now they also referred clients to me when they needed specialized consulting work. James Morrison and I had developed a mutual respect based on our shared understanding that good business relationships require honesty about what each party brings to the table. The financial success was nice, but what really mattered was the freedom. I could choose my projects, set my own schedule, and work with people I actually respected. I was no longer worried about office politics or pleasing managers who didn't understand the work I was doing. I was accountable only to my clients and to myself. On weekends, I volunteered with Girls Who Code, teaching high school students not just programming skills, but also business skills, how to negotiate, how to protect their work, how to recognize when they're being undervalued. I wished someone had taught me these things when I was starting out. One Saturday afternoon, I was working with a group of teenage girls on a web development project when one of them, a quiet sophomore named Amy, raised her hand. "Ms. Sarah, what if we want to start our own company someday? How do we make sure nobody can steal our ideas?" I smiled, remembering my own younger self, so focused on the technical challenges that I'd never thought about the business side of innovation. "That's exactly the right question to ask, Amy. And I have a lot to teach you about that." Looking back, getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to stop accepting other people's definitions of my value and start creating my own. I'd spent years being the reliable employee, the team player, the person who put the company's interests ahead of her own. But loyalty has to be mutual, and respect has to be earned. The scared, accommodating engineer who'd walked out of Melissa's office was gone. In her place was someone who understood that protecting your work isn't selfish, it's essential. Someone who knew that being nice is important, but being respected is more important. Someone who'd learned that the best way to change an unfair system is to refuse to play by its rules. I still loved solving technical problems, but now I also loved solving human problems. Teaching people to advocate for themselves, helping them understand their rights, showing them that they didn't have to choose between being good at their job and being good at business. My phone buzzed with a text from a potential new client, a robotics engineer who'd developed some breakthrough automation software. I smiled and started typing my response. There was work to do, people to help, and a future to build. One where brilliant people got to keep the value they created. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning.